Bel Air, Los Angeles, Roscomare Road, number 2551. Summer 1967, 4:07 in the morning. The street outside was empty. Every house on the block was dark. The eucalyptus trees along the ridge stood still in 64-degree air with zero wind. There was no sound from the canyon below. Nothing moved. Nothing had moved for hours. Inside the property, seated cross-legged on the flat concrete of his backyard, was a man who weighed 140 pounds and stood 5 feet 7 inches. His eyes were closed. Both hands rested open on his knees. His chest moved once every 8 seconds, not from effort, from discipline. He had been sitting in the same position for 41 minutes. His name was Bruce Lee. He was 26 years old, and at that exact moment he was trying to solve a problem that had consumed him for 3 years. The iron fence at the back of the property was 6 feet 2 inches tall. It bordered the upper edge of the lot where the terrain sloped toward Mulholland Drive. At 4:09 in the morning, something on the other side of that fence moved. Then it climbed. Then it cleared the top bar and dropped 4 feet onto the other side. The sound of boots on concrete was immediate. 2 steps, then a stop. The man who had just entered the property was not small. He was not slow. And he had no idea who was sitting 18 feet away in the dark. The next 90 seconds would not be what anyone expected. Not the intruder. Not Bruce Lee. What happened in those 90 seconds became the first real test of something that did not yet have a name. The year was 1967. Los Angeles had spent the summer at full temperature, 91 degrees in the canyons of Bel Air on most August afternoons, with a Santa Ana wind that came down from the desert each evening and dried everything it touched. The neighborhoods above Sunset Boulevard were quiet in a specific way: wide streets, gated driveways, properties set back from the road, neighbors who did not look out windows unless there was a reason. It was not a neighborhood where unexpected things happened. It was not a neighborhood where a 26-year-old Chinese-American martial arts instructor would normally own a home. Bruce Lee had moved into 2551 Roscomare Road that year, the same year he formally named what he had been building in private for 3 years. He was not yet the global phenomenon he would become. He was known to serious martial arts practitioners on both coasts, to viewers of the television show The Green Hornet, and to a small circle of Hollywood figures who had heard what he could do in a closed room. His first owned home sat on a flat lot that backed against a rising slope, with a wide concrete backyard large enough for full-speed training. That backyard mattered more than any room he had ever worked in. At 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds, Bruce Lee presented a physical profile that caused people to consistently underestimate him. His forearms, at their widest point, measured 12 inches in circumference, dense, corded, disproportionate to his frame. His resting heart rate sat at 58 beats per minute. His grip strength, recorded in training logs from the period, tested at 150 pounds per hand, a measurement that placed him above most men 60 pounds heavier. None of this was visible when he stood still. None of it was visible at 4 in the morning when he sat in his backyard with his eyes closed and his hands open on his knees. What was happening inside that stillness was not rest. It was work of a very specific kind. 3 years earlier, in December 1964, in a training hall in Oakland, California, Bruce Lee had fought a martial artist named Wong Jack Man. This is one of the most discussed events in martial arts history, documented across multiple sources and remembered differently by almost everyone who was present. Wong Jack Man was 24 at the time, approximately 5 feet 10 inches and 135 pounds. He was Northern Shaolin trained, a practitioner of one of the most complete and athletically demanding kung fu systems in existence. The fight lasted, by various accounts, somewhere between 3 minutes and 25 minutes. The range in those accounts matters. But what does not vary across any account is the outcome. Bruce Lee won, and he walked away knowing something was wrong. The fight should have ended in seconds. Instead, it dragged on. The energy expenditure disturbed him. The winded state at the end disturbed him more. He had trained in Wing Chun under Ip Man in Hong Kong since the age of 13. Wing Chun was his foundation, and in that Oakland training hall, his foundation had taken minutes to finish what should have been finished in moments. That realization changed the direction of his life. What followed was a 3-year reconstruction. Boxing footwork, derived from frame-by-frame study of Muhammad Ali's fight footage, which Bruce Lee watched on a projector in his home, rewinding the same 3-second sequences dozens of times, mapping the mechanics of Ali's shuffle with a pen and notebook. Fencing theory, specifically the concept of the stop hit, the counter-attack launched in the precise instant an opponent commits to a forward motion, borrowed directly from European épée technique and adapted for empty hands and bare feet. Judo ground principles, Taekwondo kicking mechanics, trapping and close-range interception from his Wing Chun roots, but now stripped of every ornamental form he had practiced as a teenager. One principle drove all of it: efficiency, the systematic elimination of everything that was not directly and immediately useful. He had been filling notebooks for 3 years, pages of mechanical analysis, angles of attack measured in degrees, distance mathematics, centerline geometry, the physics of force delivery at short range versus extended range. The notebooks were real. They existed. They would, after his death in 1973, be compiled into what the world came to know as the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. In 1967, they were private, and Bruce Lee knew there was a gap between what the notebooks described and what he had actually proven. The system had been designed on paper and refined in training, but it had never been tested in the one condition where the truth of a system reveals itself. When the threat is real, the distance is unknown, and there is no time to think. The 4 a.m. sessions in the Roscomare Road backyard were the ones Bruce Lee kept private. He had told one person about them, his wife Linda. He trained at that hour because the Los Angeles summer nights cooled enough by 2 a.m. that the pre-dawn air allowed full-capacity physical work without excessive water loss. He was precise about conditions. He trained when conditions were correct. He sat in the dark when the conditions called for stillness. On the night in question, the conditions were 64 degrees, 0 wind, no ambient noise from the canyon. He had been seated for 41 minutes. The man who cleared the iron fence at 4:09 a.m. had not chosen this property on purpose. This detail matters, and it should be fixed clearly. The intruder was not there for Bruce Lee. He was not a martial artist issuing a challenge. He was not affiliated with any of the San Francisco or Los Angeles kung fu communities that had disputed Bruce Lee's teaching. Based on Bruce Lee's own account to those closest to him in the days that followed, the man was someone who climbed a fence into what appeared to be an empty backyard in a wealthy neighborhood. He chose this yard because it looked unoccupied. It looked dark and quiet and still. Every yard on Roscomare Road looked that way at 4 in the morning. The difference between this one and every other yard on the street was sitting cross-legged on the concrete with his eyes closed and his hands open. The property, at 2551 Roscomare Road, sat on a lot approximately 80 feet wide and 120 feet deep. The front faced the road, a standard residential wood fence, a low hedge across the driveway. The rear of the property was different. The back boundary was marked by an iron fence, black vertical bar construction, 6 feet 2 inches in height, separating the flat concrete yard from the upward slope leading toward Mulholland Drive. The concrete pad itself measured roughly 40 feet by 30 feet. A single bulkhead light mounted above the rear service door of the house cast a pale circle of illumination that reached approximately 12 feet from the wall. Beyond 12 feet, the yard was dark. Bruce Lee was seated at approximately 18 feet from the light source. In the dark zone, eyes closed. Linda Lee was inside the house, asleep. Their son Brandon, 3 years old, was upstairs. The house was silent. The yard had been silent for 41 minutes. Iron fencing produces a specific sound when weight is applied to it, not a crash, a metallic strain, the sound a load-bearing structure makes when lateral force is applied to vertical bars that were not designed to be climbed. It is a sound that anyone who has spent time near iron fencing would recognize. Bruce Lee had trained in enclosed spaces his entire life. He mapped rooms and yards by their acoustics the way other people mapped them with their eyes. He recognized the sound in the first fraction of a second. His eyes opened before the climber cleared the top bar. He did not stand up. This is the detail that every subsequent account agreed on. When the fence made its first sound, Bruce Lee's eyes opened. He identified the direction, the far back corner of the fence line, 47 feet from his position. He identified what was happening, and he made no movement. He remained seated, both hands open on his knees, breathing at the same measured rate, and he waited. The climber cleared the top bar of the fence at 4:09 a.m., approximately 2 minutes after the first sounds of approach had been audible from beyond the property line. The drop from the top of the fence to the concrete was 4 feet. Both boots landed at the same time. The sound was hard, leather soles on bare concrete, and it was immediate in the 64-degree stillness of the yard. 2 steps, then a full stop. The intruder was a man. His approximate height, as Bruce Lee described him to Linda the following morning, was around 6 feet 1 inch. His weight was not documented precisely but was described as large, estimated at 200 pounds or more. He wore dark clothing, dark jacket, dark trousers. He had cleared a 6'2" fence with enough athleticism to control his descent, which required meaningful upper body strength for the pull-up motion and a coordinated drop. He was not physically untrained. Standing at the base of the fence, 47 feet from Bruce Lee, in a yard he believed was empty, the man did not move for 6 full seconds after landing. Bruce Lee still did not stand up. He spoke, 1 sentence, not shouted, not whispered, calm in volume, measured in delivery. The exact words were not preserved in any written record. What Linda Lee recalled from her husband's description the next morning was this: he said something that made the man understand he had been detected from the first instant he touched the fence. 1 sentence, delivered at a volume normally reserved for conversation, with no elevation in tone whatsoever. The effect was immediate. The intruder took several steps backward, his shoulders turning toward the fence he had just come over. Then he stopped, because the man sitting cross-legged in the dark, 47 feet away, had still not moved, had not stood up, had not raised his voice, had not reached for anything. That stillness, the specific quality of that stillness, was more disorienting than any display of force could have been. 4:09 a.m. Boots on concrete. Bruce Lee seated cross-legged 47 feet away, eyes open, breathing unchanged. The following sequence was reconstructed from Bruce Lee's accounts to the 3 people who heard it within 72 hours, Linda Lee, Taki Kimura, and Dan Inosanto. Each remembered the details slightly differently. Each remembered the core event, what happened, what did not happen, and how it ended, in exactly the same way. The geometry of the yard was fixed. The intruder stood at the far back corner of the concrete pad, his back approximately 3 feet from the iron fence he had just cleared. Bruce Lee sat 47 feet away in the dark portion of the yard. The available exits were back over the fence, through a narrow passage along the left side of the house, or through the front driveway. The rear service door of the house, 12 feet behind Bruce Lee's position, was closed but not locked. Bruce Lee, 5 feet 7 inches, 140 pounds, seated, cross-legged, hands open. The intruder, approximately 6 feet 1 inch, an estimated 200 pounds, standing 2 steps from the fence, 47 feet of open concrete between them. Bruce Lee spoke first, a single sentence, calm in volume, measured in delivery, stating that the person at the far end of the yard had been heard from the first sound on the fence. The sentence took approximately 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, Bruce Lee did not move his hands, did not shift his weight, did not alter his seated posture. The bulkhead light 18 feet behind him meant the intruder could see only a silhouette, a seated figure, motionless, speaking in a register that belonged to a kitchen table, not a confrontation. The absolute contrast between the situation and the tone was the first piece of information the intruder's nervous system had to process. The intruder's response was physical before it was cognitive, a visible flinch, not a full step backward, but a reflexive weight shift of several inches. Shoulders first. His hands came partially up, paused, then returned to his sides. The gesture was not a decision, it was an indicator. The body receiving information the conscious mind had not yet organized into action. Then silence. 6 full seconds. Neither man moved. Bruce Lee observed the intruder throughout those 6 seconds and described what he saw to Kimura the next afternoon with the precision of a man who had spent 14 years training his eyes to read bodies at distance. The intruder's breathing had accelerated beyond what the physical effort of climbing one fence would account for. The rate was consistent with adrenaline, not exertion. His chin had dropped from its landing position, an involuntary indicator of someone recalibrating their understanding of an environment that has turned out to be different from what they expected. His weight had shifted forward onto the balls of both feet, the universal preparation posture for either advance or retreat, adopted by the body before the mind has decided which it will be. And his eyes had not moved, not once. They were fixed on the seated figure in the dark. Eyes that remain locked on a stationary person are not scanning for exits. They are still reading. The intruder's body had already begun its preparations to leave. His eyes had not yet communicated the instruction to his legs. Bruce Lee spoke again. A second sentence. Same volume. Same register. This one was not a statement. It was an offer. The passage along the left side of the house was clear. He was willing to remain where he sat for 30 seconds to allow its use. After that, he said, the conditions would change. The sentence was mechanical. No anger, no performance, no inflation. It was the verbal equivalent of what Bruce Lee had been writing in his notebooks for 3 years. Provide the opponent with all necessary information, once, directly, without decoration. Then, wait. The intruder took 2 steps toward the left side of the house. Then he stopped. He looked back at the seated figure for 3 full seconds. Bruce Lee had not moved, hands still open on his knees, posture identical to the moment the boots first hit concrete. That stop was the decision point. The body had moved first, 2 steps toward the exit before the mind completed the evaluation. The stop was the mind catching up, and when it caught up, it confirmed what the body already knew. The second movement, the continuous walk toward the passage, was post-decision, smooth, directed, accelerating, committed. 12 steps to the passage alongside the house, a pace faster than walking and slower than running, the sound of a wooden latchgate, spring-loaded, opening and closing. Footsteps on the narrow concrete path, then the front driveway gate, then nothing. The street was empty. The eucalyptus trees did not move. The yard returned to its previous state. 64 degrees, no wind. One man seated on concrete in the dark. Bruce Lee sat for another 14 minutes. He did not pursue. He did not stand at the fence and watch the man leave. He did not go inside to wake Linda. He did not check the perimeter or inspect the gate. He sat in the same position, with his hands in the same place, and continued the session he had been engaged in for the previous 41 minutes. Except now his eyes were open, and whatever was happening behind those eyes was not the same thing that had been happening before 4:09. At 4:27 a.m., 18 minutes after the boots hit concrete, Bruce Lee stood up. He went inside through the rear service door. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened his notebook. He wrote for 23 minutes. Then he went back outside and ran Roscomare Road for 40 minutes in the pre-dawn dark. The man who entered the yard was 6 feet 1 inch and approximately 200 pounds. The man who sat on the concrete was 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds. The physical difference in mass was 60 pounds. The height difference was 6 inches. The distance between them at maximum was 47 feet. At minimum, 47 feet. That distance never closed, because Bruce Lee never moved. The thing that made the man leave was not a physical threat. It was the specific quality of the stillness directed at him and the precision of the 2 sentences it produced. The tea was green. He made it in a small ceramic pot he kept on the kitchen counter, simple, well-used, the kind of object that belongs to a daily practice rather than an occasion. The process took 4 minutes from the moment the rear service door closed behind him. He stood at the counter facing the kitchen window while the water heated. The window looked out over the front garden, not the backyard. He did not look toward the backyard. Linda Lee remained asleep. Brandon remained asleep. The house was completely quiet. A clock on the kitchen wall read 4:31 when Bruce Lee sat down at the table with the tea and opened his notebook. The notebook was one of several he kept in that period. Black cover, unlined pages. He had filled portions of it with diagrams, footwork geometries, striking angles measured in degrees, annotated sketches of body positions at different ranges. The entries were not consistently dated. What he wrote in those 23 minutes was dated summer 1967, approx 4:30 a.m. Linda Lee read the entry that same morning after Bruce left for his run. She would later describe it not as notes, but as a correction, as if he had found an error in something he had written before and was revising his own understanding in real time on the page. The error, as he would explain it to Taki Kimura the following afternoon, was in his previous understanding of what response actually was. For 3 years, the notebooks had operated on an assumption that effective response required preparation, a state of heightened readiness, a trained catalogue of options held in accessible memory, available for rapid deployment when a threat appeared. The backyard had contradicted this assumption completely. At 4:09 a.m., Bruce Lee had not been in a state of readiness. He had been in a state of total stillness, eyes closed, mind quiet. And when the sound came, the first metallic strain of weight on iron, the response had preceded any decision to respond. Not fast response, something prior to response. The sentence he spoke, the tone he selected, the geometric calculation of distance and position, the specific offer of exit, none of it had been assembled from a prepared catalogue. It had come from the stillness itself, without interruption, without the fraction of a second gap between stimulus and decision that most trained fighters fill with the error of choosing what to do. There had been no choosing, there had been responding, and the difference between those two words was the difference between what the notebooks described and what had actually happened on the concrete. He wrote the entry in 23 minutes. He underlined one phrase 3 times. At 7:15 a.m., Linda came downstairs. She found her husband at the kitchen table with a second cup of tea and the notebook open, but he was not writing. He was reading backward through previous entries, stopping at certain passages and reading them again in the light of what he had written 3 hours earlier. She described the scene in a single image. He looked like a man who had finished an argument with himself. He told her what happened in the backyard. The account took approximately 6 minutes. He used no dramatic language. He described the sound on the fence, the figure, the 2 sentences, the exit, the 14 minutes of continued sitting, the tea, the notebook. He described it the way he might describe the route of his morning run. Then he closed the notebook. Linda asked one question. "What did you write down?" He told her. She would not record his exact words. What she remembered was the feeling behind the explanation, that something which had been abstract for 3 years had overnight become concrete, that the man sitting across from her was not unsettled by what had happened. He was satisfied, not the satisfaction of winning something, the satisfaction of a person who has been looking for a specific measurement for a long time and has finally found it in the world rather than on the page. Brandon came downstairs at 7:40. The kitchen shifted. Bruce made breakfast. The morning proceeded as mornings do. Taki Kimura arrived at 2:15 that afternoon. He was 43 years old. He had been training with Bruce Lee for 8 years, one of the first students Bruce had ever formally taught, beginning in Seattle in 1959. He had watched the entire trajectory from Wing Chun through Junfan Gung Fu through 3 years of what Bruce called a new direction. He had read the notebooks. He had sparred with Bruce more times than he could accurately count. He knew the system as well as anyone alive who was not Bruce Lee. Bruce met him in the backyard, not at the training area, at the center of the concrete pad, the same position, approximately 18 feet from the service door, where he had been seated the previous night. The session did not begin with drills or sparring. It began with Bruce telling Kimura what had happened. Kimura listened. He stood at the edge of the concrete without moving or interrupting. When Bruce finished, Kimura remained silent for what he later described as at least a minute. Then he asked one question. "Why didn't you move?" Bruce Lee answered. He spoke for approximately 8 minutes. It was the longest uninterrupted explanation Kimura had ever heard him give. It moved through the physical events of the night, the sound sequence, the geometry, the behavioral observations, the offer, the departure. Then it moved past the events and into what they had revealed. The notebooks, he said, were a system. A system is built and then tested. But what happened in the backyard was not a test of the system. It was the thing the system had been trying to describe. The event preceded its own explanation. The notebooks were now catching up to something that had already occurred without their help. Kimura would later describe those 8 minutes as the most significant teaching he ever received from Bruce Lee. Not because of any physical demonstration, because in 8 minutes on a concrete pad in Bel Air, the philosophy stopped being a philosophy and became a description of something that had happened to a real person in a real place at a specific time. No drills were performed that afternoon, no sparring. Bruce Lee and Taki Kimura stood on the concrete pad for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Kimura asked questions. Bruce answered. They went through the notebooks page by page, some entries going back to 1965. For each entry, Bruce now had a corrective layer, what the entry had assumed versus what the backyard had shown. Some entries were confirmed exactly as written, some required minor adjustment, 3 were crossed out entirely. At approximately 5 p.m., as the light over Bel Air shifted from afternoon white to early evening amber, a third person arrived. James Coburn, tall, angular, one of Bruce Lee's most dedicated students for 2 years, appeared at the edge of the concrete pad and stopped without speaking. Something about the way the two men were standing made him wait at the perimeter. He waited for approximately 3 minutes before Bruce noticed him and gestured him over. Coburn heard the conclusion. He did not have the context of the 8 minutes or the 2 hours and 40 minutes of notebook review, but what he heard, the final compressed statement, he never forgot. Dan Inosanto heard the account within the week. He was 31, already developing the analytical precision that would eventually make him the foremost living interpreter of Jeet Kune Do. Bruce told him the story in 4 sentences. The 8-minute explanation that Kimura received had been compressed to 4 sentences. Inosanto later made an observation about the compression itself. The first time a person speaks from experience, he said, they use many words because the experience is still larger than the language. By the 3rd or 4th telling, the language has caught up to the experience. By the 5th, the language is the thing. 3 people heard the account in the first 72 hours. Each remembered different details. Each remembered the same core event. What happened, what did not happen, and what it meant, without variation. Bruce Lee's explanation to Kimura, in the version Kimura carried for the rest of his life, came down to this. The man left because the situation he expected to enter did not exist. He had no framework for the situation that did exist, and when a person encounters a situation for which they have no framework, they return to the last framework that worked. The last framework that worked, for the intruder, was not being in this yard. He did not apologize. He chose an exit. And what he left behind on a concrete pad in Bel Air at 4:27 in the morning was the clearest proof Bruce Lee had ever encountered of a principle he had spent 3 years trying to name. The name had been chosen earlier that year, Jeet Kune Do, in English, way of the intercepting fist. The principle of interception, countering an opponent in the exact moment of their commitment before their attack completes, was the physical mechanism at the center of the system. It was the stop hit from fencing translated into a complete fighting philosophy. It was what the 3 years of cross-training and notebook analysis had been building toward. But the backyard had revealed that interception operated at a level more fundamental than technique. It was not simply a counter-move. It was not a physical action at all in its deepest form. It was a state, a condition of readiness so complete that it did not feel like readiness, it felt like stillness, and from that state any response was equally available, equally immediate because no prior selection had been made. The response was not chosen from a menu, it emerged from the absence of a menu, and that state, Bruce Lee now understood, was not produced by preparation, it was produced by the removal of everything that interfered with what was already there. Within months, the principles derived from the backyard night began showing up in Bruce Lee's teaching with a new clarity. Kimura noted specific shifts in how Bruce explained non-telegraphing in sessions throughout early 1968. Before the summer of 1967, the concept had been explained in mechanical terms. The body moves without announcing its intention. The strike arrives before its preparation is visible to the opponent. After, the explanation had a second layer. The psychological precondition that made mechanical efficiency possible. The mechanical efficiency Bruce now taught was not the primary skill. The precondition was, and the precondition was not calmness, not focus, not relaxation, not any state that had a name and could be deliberately entered. It was the specific absence of the thought that normally precedes movement, the fraction of a second in which a trained fighter decides what to do. That fraction of a second was the error. The backyard had eliminated it. And the question now driving Bruce Lee's teaching was whether it could be eliminated reliably, repeatedly, in anyone. In 1968, Bruce Lee closed his formal schools. He stopped teaching group classes entirely. His instruction became purely private. A small circle of students, each selected carefully, each working on a different aspect of the system. The Roscomare Road backyard was the primary training space. A permanent wooden platform was built at the right rear corner for footwork training. The iron fence remained unchanged, the bulkhead light remained. The center of the concrete pad, the approximate position where Bruce Lee sat on the night that changed his understanding, became the place he most often stood during sessions. If any student training in that yard between 1968 and 1970 wondered why Bruce always returned to the same spot, the answer was 18 feet from the service door and 47 feet from the back fence, the spot where the principle had proven itself. Steve McQueen trained in that yard, James Coburn trained there, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, 7 feet 2 inches, 265 pounds, trained there in sessions that became among the most physically remarkable in Bruce Lee's documented career. The image of those two men working together, 140 pounds and 265 pounds, 5 feet 7 and 7 feet 2, was the size assessment problem made visible in living form. Everything the intruder's nervous system had miscalculated on that summer night was on display every time Abdul-Jabbar and Bruce Lee faced each other on the concrete. The smaller man was not the lesser threat. The calibration was wrong. And the reason the calibration was wrong had nothing to do with strength or speed or skill. It had to do with what was present in the stillness before any of those things were deployed. The notebooks continued to fill. By the end of 1968, the accumulated material constituted a manuscript. Bruce Lee never published it in his lifetime. The Tao of Jeet Kune Do was compiled by Linda Lee Cadwell and published in 1975, 2 years after Bruce Lee's death on July 20, 1973, at the age of 32. It has since sold hundreds of thousands of copies and been translated into dozens of languages. It remains in print. It is referenced by martial artists, athletes, philosophers, military strategists, and performance psychologists across the world. In the introduction, Linda Lee describes it as the notes of a man in the process of creating something entirely new. Among its passages, one line has been quoted more than almost any other. It speaks of the relationship between inner rigidity and outer perception, the idea that when nothing within you is fixed, the world around you becomes legible. It is a statement about receptivity, about the elimination of interference, about the state that Bruce Lee entered on a concrete pad in Bel Air at 4:07 on a summer morning, and that was confirmed 2 minutes later when a man climbed a fence and found, 47 feet away, a kind of stillness he had no framework to understand. The iron fence at 2551 Roscomare Road was still standing when the property last changed hands. The concrete pad remained in its original configuration. The bulkhead light above the rear service door remained in its original position. The distance from the light to the center of the pad, where one man sat still in the dark while another man decided to leave, was 18 feet. 47 feet away, the fence had no marker, no plaque, no inscription. It did not need one. Humans measure size first. This is not cultural. It is not learned. It is a mammalian calibration system that operates in the first 300 milliseconds of any encounter that the brain registers as potentially threatening. The measurement occurs before language, before facial recognition, before any conscious processing. It is a rapid survey of height, mass, posture, and what the hands are doing. The brain produces a single binary output, larger or smaller than me, and that output generates the first behavioral response, the micro-posture shift, the change in shoulder angle, the chin position, the decision about eye contact. All of this happens in 300 milliseconds. All of it is involuntary. For most of human evolutionary history, this system was accurate. Larger meant more dangerous. The calibration fit the conditions. In an environment where physical mass determined the outcome of physical encounters, measuring mass first was the correct survival strategy. But the system has a critical flaw. It measures size. It does not measure what happens in the first 2 seconds of contact at close range, which is where every real physical confrontation begins and, in most documented cases, also ends. At close range, mass advantage diminishes sharply because the mechanical efficiency of a strike does not scale proportionally with body weight. A 140-pound person generating a focused strike at 3 inches of travel delivers force that is wildly disproportionate to what the 300 millisecond size assessment would predict. The assessment is not wrong about mass, it is wrong about the range at which mass determines outcomes. Bruce Lee understood this mechanically before the summer of 1967. The notebooks from 1965 and 1966 contain detailed analysis, force delivery at 6 inches versus 18 inches, the relationship between hip rotation speed and impact force, the physics of why a short-range strike from a trained person of moderate weight transfers more effective energy than a long-range strike from a heavier, untrained person. The calculations were correct, the mechanical understanding was complete. What the backyard added was not new mechanics. It was the discovery that the precondition for those mechanics was not what he had assumed. He had assumed the precondition was a trained state, a heightened readiness built from years of practice, a loaded catalogue of responses ready for deployment. What the backyard revealed was the opposite. The precondition was the absence of the catalogue, not the absence of knowledge, the absence of interference from knowledge. When the boots hit concrete at 4:09 a.m., Bruce Lee did not cycle through his options. He did not select from 14 years of accumulated technique. He responded from stillness, without accessing any internal catalogue at all. The sentence he produced was efficient, maximum relevant information, minimum expenditure of energy. The tone communicated something more important than the content, that the person speaking had no investment in any particular outcome, no preference for fight or flight, no desire for the intruder to stay or leave, no stake in what happened next, simply a transmission of accurate information followed by a clear offer, followed by silence. That absence of investment was, by every observable behavioral indicator in the intruder's response, the decisive factor. A person who is invested in an outcome telegraphs that investment through micro-behaviors that are involuntary and readable at distance. Voice elevation, accelerated speech rate, postural forward lean, increased blinking, hand tension. These are not choices. They are signals produced by a nervous system that has committed to a preferred outcome and is expending energy to achieve it. When those signals are present, the other person's nervous system reads them and draws a conclusion. This individual's response can be predicted because they have shown what they want. Predictability reduces threat because a predictable opponent can be anticipated. When those signals are completely absent, the reading system receives a different message entirely. It receives, "This person has accounted for all contingencies. They have no preference, which means they have no vulnerability. They cannot be predicted, which means they cannot be anticipated." That reading, transmitted in the same 300 milliseconds the brain uses to assess size, is functionally identical to a demonstration of overwhelming capability. The intruder's nervous system processed it correctly, and it overrode the size assessment entirely. This is why the witnesses remembered numbers. Taki Kimura remembered 47 feet. Linda Lee remembered 4:09 a.m. and 90 seconds. Dan Inosanto remembered 4 sentences, the compressed version. James Coburn remembered 3 minutes standing at the edge of the concrete before being gestured over. The human memory under conditions of emotional significance anchors to numbers because numbers are the components of experience that do not change across tellings. The narrative shifts, the numbers hold, and the number that every person who heard the account remembered without any variation was the same. One man, 140 pounds, seated, did not stand up. A second man, 60 pounds heavier, left. That ratio, 60 pounds heavier, left, is what the brain stored, because it contradicted the 300 millisecond calibration. Larger left, smaller stayed. The contradiction created a memory anchor strong enough to survive decades of retelling without distortion. It was filed not as a story, but as a data correction, a revision of something the nervous system had previously believed to be true. Why did Bruce Lee not pursue? He was asked this in subsequent years. His answer, across every documented conversation, carried the same core. Pursuit is evidence that the initial response was incomplete. If the first response was sufficient, the information delivered, the offer made, the decision left to the other person, then pursuit would be a second attempt at something the first attempt had already resolved. He was not interested in second attempts. He was interested in economy. No humiliation was delivered because none had been sought. No chase was necessary because the exit had been offered freely. No lecture was given because Bruce Lee did not teach people who had not asked to be taught. These are not moral positions. They are mechanical ones. Each of those actions, humiliation, chase, lecture, costs energy. Each reintroduces investment in outcome. An investment in outcome is the thing that produces the anxiety signals the intruder's nervous system would have used to reassess the threat. Bruce Lee eliminated the possibility of that reassessment by eliminating the investment that would have fueled it. The encounter at 2551 Roscomare Road was, in one sense, the smallest venue in which a significant event in the history of martial philosophy ever occurred. No tournament, no audience, no opponent of documented credentials, no challenge issued or accepted. One man who sat still, one man who climbed a fence and walked back out through the side passage. and 23 minutes of writing in a kitchen afterward. In Bel Air, California, in the summer of 1967, Bruce Lee sat on concrete in the dark at 4:09 in the morning, and a man 60 pounds heavier chose, without being touched, to leave. What he wrote in the notebook afterward, nobody needed to witness. The concrete holds what it holds. Be like water making its way through cracks. Do not be assertive but adjust to the object, and you shall find a way around or through it. Bruce Lee.